Hello and welcome to Arcast, a podcast from the Royal College of Art, home to the next generation of creatives, and the world's #1 art and design university, representing the largest concentration of postgraduate artists and designers on the planet. We'll be bringing you insight into the philosophy behind the programmes at the RCA by talking to staff, students, and the wider RCA community about what we do here and how the work of architects, artists, communicators, designers, and researchers affect the world at large. I'm Benji Jeffrey, and today I'll be talking to Thandi Loewenson about this year's Venice Biennale and education's place in the act of decolonising. Thandi is an architectural designer and researcher who mobilises design, fiction, and performance to stoke embers of emancipatory political thought and fires of collective action. And she's also senior tutor on our architecture MA here at the RCA. Thandi, thank you for joining us today.
Most welcome.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. It's very exciting to be here, discovering entirely new rooms of the RCA I didn't know about.
Yeah, we are we have a sound studio here at the RCA, which is where we are recording today, which is a weirdly calm space.
Yeah, it's great.
In the bowels of one of our buildings. So let's start off by talking about the Venice Biennale. Can you tell us a bit about what happened this year?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it was... being in Venice for the opening of the Biennale, this is not a flex, it's just a fact, was a bit like being in JMU's. There were just so many people from the RCA there participating, part of events, part of exhibiting their own work. And so it was quite amazing, actually. And I joined the RCA about 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so it was this wonderful culmination of a few years of alumni, of people I've been teaching with over the last few years. And it was fantastic. It was really fantastic.
And I believe there was something like 20 odd people from the RCA that were involved in the Biennale as well.
Yeah, no, it was incredible. I would cautiously say it was almost unprecedented. I think the RCA was the largest institution represented there. And very different kinds of people. So as I mentioned, alumni, people that are working and teaching at the RCA, people that are doing research here, but also alumni who've now become members of faculty. So there's really nice intergenerational and kind of history in the cohort of people that were there, which was great.
Nice.
It was really good.
And the theme this year was the laboratory of the future, which was putting Africa in the spotlight as the laboratory of the future, right?
Yes, yeah. And Leslie was also, Leslie Locco, the curator of the Biennale, was also really interested in framing the Biennale around the two concurrent themes of decolonisation and decarbonisation. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to fundamentally rebuild our world, our forms of relation between one another as people, but also between people and the earth towards more equitable and fair futures? The kinds of futures which, in the words of Eric Olin Wright, enable the fullest flourishing of us all, for the many, not for the few. Mm. Which is ambitious, which is grand, which is really imaginative, and that's something that I want to talk about a bit more. But I guess maybe it's important to think a little bit about what does this mean for architecture? How does architecture fit within these kind of grander, larger ambitions and aims? Mm. And I think one thing that is important to recognise is that architecture has kind of really long been utilised within projects of colonialism, racial capitalism, and carbon-based economies, quite literally to build a world and to build world views. So segregations between people built through walls and borders, land management and extractive practices, the kinds of gendered, labour and class relations, these uses and kinds of expressions of space construct and cement through their construction, but also the materials which we use to build them and how we care, repair and tend to them over time or don't, and who does this work. And so to take decolonisation and decarbonisation seriously from an architectural perspective is to quite radically reconsider these fundamentals of architecture, right?
Yeah.
And in the Biennale, Leslie Locco's curation includes two really interesting sections, which I think are really interesting and kind of exemplify the sort of fearlessness that is needed to do this kind of brave work. And they're titled The Guests from the Future and Dangerous Liaisons. And here, which is mostly in the Arsenale, is where you'll find practitioners who are operating at the fringes of what has previously been called the discipline, what's been called architecture, right? So works that engage architecture through performance, through sculpture, through film, through spoken word, and more and more. And this is dangerous work, as Leslie's title for this section kind of calls our attention to. which has especially younger practitioners in it. And I think it's dangerous work, especially for younger practitioners, to be kind of taking those risks. There's a quote from Sarah Ahmed that I really like, which is that once you point to the flaws within hegemonic ideas or dominant ideas of doing and building the world, you yourself become the problem.
Right.
So to do this kind of work and to do it on a global scale, which many of these practitioners are doing, is incredibly brave and brilliant work, actually. And so I'm very honoured and very proud to see so many of our students, so many of our research community and practice community doing this work, and to be a part of them too.
Yeah. And what does that look like? Thinking about performance, for example, how do we engage with that in the Biennale in a way that starts to do that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. So the Biennale looks very different to what architecture biennales have looked like in the past, certainly the ones that I've been to.
Yeah.
There are lots of dark rooms with films and screens and performances taking place within them. The idea of how we might understand space and how space might be interrogated is also expanded fundamentally. So where you might have seen lots of models or drawings of buildings, you now see drawings and tapestries and more sculptural works alongside those buildings. There's a project by one of our alumni, Lauren Loewenson, who is an alumni from ADS2, which is taught by Dele Adeyemo, Ibie Camp, and Damaso Randolphe. And Dele and Ibie are also showing work in the Biennale. And her work is a woven tapestry that explores kind of global networks of fabrics and clothes recycling. So how secondhand clothes largely from the West are dumped in the Ghanaian market, and how they then become recycled, revalorized, particularly by young women who use them to create livelihoods, to navigate the city and open up their markets in really interesting and ingenious ways, and kind of contest this idea of a wasted material, but also that they themselves have been excluded from globalized international markets and networks of material remediation and so on. So Lauren Lois's piece is this incredible tapestry that explores these spatial practices of these women, but also thinks very carefully about how her own material engagement through tapestry and through working with fabric can have quite close engagement to do that work, which is really interesting, I think, for an architecture student to be working very closely with fabrics and with tapestry making. And Lauren Lois talks a lot about how she found herself in the workshops that deal with fabric at the RCA and was like, what am I doing?
Right.
But that's one of the amazing benefits of having an architecture school within an art school.
Yeah.
Because you get those kinds of quite radical encounters and see the kinds of fantastic work that produces too.
Yeah. And how do these works that I suppose are kind of proposals in a way for ways of thinking, if we're going to be quite literal about what architecture is, how does this how do you envisage that this could be translated into kind of producing the world that we want to see?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, when I was studying architecture, many years when I was studying architecture, there was a sort of throwaway comment that really stuck with me from one of my tutors, who said that architects don't make buildings, they make drawings of buildings.
Right.
They make designs of buildings. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, and I think certainly the work of many of my colleagues and of our students shows that architects are really engaged in the nuts and bolts, in the one-to-one of really building and making the world. And there is a lot of that. And you certainly see that within the Biennale. But I think what's interesting about this Biennale, and certainly Leslie's framing of this Biennale, is to say that the world is made not just through construction and through the act of physically building, but also through the ideas and ideologies that underpin that work. And so part of that practice, part of that work of building another world, is also radically reconsidering what those ideas that underpin the buildings that we make and the spaces that we make are rooted in. Yeah.
And to what extent do you think that will be translated out into the world? You know, quite often these biennales can be little bubbles, like little utopias. Do you see that is extending beyond the Biennale?
It's an interesting question. I hope so. I think this Biennale was particularly innovative, certainly within the world of architecture, in terms of the breadth of practitioners that it involved. You know, I taught for a while in South Africa. A lot of my work engages with Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and so on. And it was remarkable how much of the continent was represented at this Biennale.
Yeah.
In a way that I've never seen before. And so these are people that are already doing this work in the world. And so I'd maybe flip the question a little bit, actually, and say it's perhaps more for the Biennale's bubble to start to see more what's going on in the world than vice versa.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think there's one of the coups that the Biennale has also done is to draw attention to this kind of work. You know, Biennales are really important in terms of, in my opinion, in terms of giving platform to existing work and practices and practitioners, but also in terms of valorizing and legitimizing particular kinds of work and saying, actually, this is worthy of presentation at an international level. And so it also means that people that are interested in doing this kind of work or in asking these kinds of questions and making these kinds of spatial provocations and political provocations are encouraged and supported to do that by seeing it be platformed at a scale such as this one. So it's hard to say exactly what the impact of it is yet, but these are some of the directions that I can see the impact of it could go.
Yeah.
I mean, it also really bolsters the work of people already doing this work, but who may not be getting the recognition that they deserve.
And talking of bolstering people's work, you got a special mention in the category of the Golden Lion, which is very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a bit about what your work was at the Biennale?
Yes, yeah. I mean, you know, and I was in really good company. My colleague Emilio Distretti, who is a research tutor in the MA Architecture program, was part of the team that actually won the Golden Lion for participants. Yusuf Agbo Ola was exhibiting in the British Pavilion, which also received a special mention for the Golden Lion of National Pavilion participants. So it was a good day for the RCA.
Yeah.
My work is a series of drawings and a film that is exhibited in the Central Pavilion, and it takes its title from a rocket that was launched from Kenya in 1970, the Uhuru satellite, which was the first satellite to really image the universe in quite a radically new way. So it was the first X-ray astronomy satellite.
Oh, wow.
Through which we got evidence of black holes, of Magellanic clouds, of all sorts of, quite seismic discoveries were made. So the work looks at this series of drawings that was produced from that satellite, from that moment. The task of drawing the universe, no less. But it also it sort of situates this moment within the independence that was happening in Kenya at the time, and a kind of pushback, as I frame it, that was happening from former colonial powers in the UK, Italy and the US. So it was a project between NASA and the Italian Space Agency, or the Italian government. And through this, we kind of see that while decolonisation, with its attendant liberations of land, sexuality, class, gender, was happening on the ground through the Kenyan Independence Project, there was this seeding of the air that was happening at the same time. So this maintenance of control of the air above the ground that has increasingly become more and more important today with satellite technologies, which are used for extraction, for surveillance, for militaristic purposes, space-based warfare and so on. So there's this, the work kind of brings into the frame these tensions where the land is won back, but then is ceded through this occupation of the air and the increasing importance of the air. So that's what the work was really looking at through that project, yeah.
Amazing. And is there much thought within the architectural community about the potential colonisation of space? So just while you were talking about that, I was just thinking that's the next frontier, I guess, of potential colonisation.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I hope the work shows, it's not necessarily an emergent frontier. It's long. Right. It's almost long been one. Yes, I think this is something that is present within architectural discourse at the moment. And one example that I could point to is Ibiye Camp's work, Ibiye, who I mentioned earlier, a tutor on ADS2. So Ibiye's work looks at data, which she frames as a kind of new gold, particularly in Sierra Leone. And she looks at how the worlds of data are kind of, in many ways, similarly to this discussion around colonization and carbon that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
the terms with which we engage with data are prescribed by those who control the technologies and who have disseminated and control the dissemination of those technologies and access to those technologies. So what happens when they encounter the African continent and they create new or emergent or they continue existing forms of domination and control through these spaces. So her work, it really looks in quite an amazing way at how contestations might be built into those worlds. So she's working through glitch, through disruption, through subversion as some of the tools of the architect within a digitally based space.
Right, okay. Just thinking about glitch, it's interesting to think about things such as glitch being taken in those ways, because in a way, they're things that have been appropriated from DIY culture that are then being brought into the. I don't know quite where I'm going with that, but they're just interesting things that start to become recurrent themes running through these ideologies.
100%, and I think it's really interesting. And I have a collaborator and someone who I'm incredibly inspired by, Miriam Hilawi Abraham, who is an Ethiopian-based designer. She talks about how often when we talk about Africa and technology in relation to Africa, we're talking about hacking or kind of make do. And there's actually a lot of really interesting ideas around how those terms or those methods become subversions. But also that actually there's much more sophisticated work going on there. Within the work of the glitch. There's potential for really interesting subversions to be built in. But subversions that also that are generative of alternatives. And within those subversions, there are perhaps other kinds of worlds and other kinds of practices entirely that don't necessarily rely on contestation, but are also rooted in generation, right?
Yeah, amazing. So thinking back to the RCA with some of these things, how do these ideas start to get embedded at the RCA, and what other ideas are kind of coming to the fore in the programs here?
Yes, absolutely. So, I made a kind of joke earlier about how being at the Biennale was a bit like being in J Muse.
Just for context, J Muse is the lovely little cobbled street we have outside RCA Kensington where everyone meets.
Yeah. But I think that it was quite amazing. The thing that struck me about there being so many RCA practitioners there was that it was a real moment of recognition of how seriously people are taking these ideas and are taking the kind of call to radical reinvention of the practice of the discipline of architecture within our community. In really rigorous and serious ways, and the level to which this is happening. So, frankly, I think this is quite sick. And our community is quite serious about not accepting the cards we've been dealt, and instead being a part of rethinking this practice, how architecture should be done, with whom, by whom, and this is across all our programs, really. So you find it in MA architecture through a host of ADS studios that are tackling climate and coloniality through a range of different and varied perspectives. So students can really come at it from many different angles.
And what does ADS stand for again?
Yes, Architectural Design Studio.
Architectural Design Studios.
You,
just double checking.
The RCA is made of acronyms. RCA is even one of them.
Yeah.
We see this in interior design, for example, where interior life and futures are kind of brought into the frame of scrutiny. In environmental architecture and city design, where extraction, land use, and existing and emergent frontiers of expulsion and expropriation are really being critically engaged, alongside communities in some of the most acute contexts of the worlds in which this is being felt. And also in the MRes and the PhD too. We've also recently launched a new MArch in design practice. So it's a new master's, which really speaks quite closely to the themes of the Biennale, which I'd like to talk about a bit too.
Yeah.
So it's a one-year program that takes climate as a central focus, and through which students will consider how reuse, materials, waste, and embodied carbon intersect with economics, politics, and identity to kind of really critically engage how design supports this just transition towards fair and flourishing worlds. So through the program, students will really be exposed to a host of ideas, to different tools and methods of coming at climate and its relationships with architecture in a number of ways. And then through a final research project in the third term, start to make their own claims and propositions around how just transition can be realised too.
And within that programme, there will be a capacity to collaborate and work with people on different programmes as well, which I guess starts to bring down the boundaries of what could be considered architecture in the way that you were talking about someone working with textiles, maybe not feeling like it should be, well, not feeling that it should be, but feeling like they were out of their pond in doing so.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, this is part of a suite of really exciting programs where an enormous chunk of the program is dedicated to elective units which can be taken across any school in the college. So, an architecture student will be studying alongside someone from the School of Design, from the School of Communication. And I think what's really interesting for me is that they'll then be coming back to the School of Architecture within the third term and really quite seriously thinking about what does that exposure mean? What has that done to their practice? But also really excitingly for us is we're within the School of Architecture going to be teaching students from all parts of the college too. So it's an exciting time. Definitely.
And I think it really ties into this idea of architecture as an exhibitable act, which is just something I've been thinking about while you've been talking about the Venice Biennale, and particularly as we've just got RCA 2023 going on at the moment. So we have our online platform with all the students. In interior design, they have these kind of speculative futures, right? Where they imagine there's just one work I can think of, which is by someone called Lucy Nurnberg, which is this speculative dike rescue service.
Amazing.
So it's this incredible idea of queering the future of what a kind of car rescue operation might look like. And I guess that's something that starts to come through within these MArch, right? They kind of have a more speculative take, or maybe I'm misunderstanding that.
No, I mean, I think... I think one of the things that I find brilliant about the Biennale, sorry to loop it all back together,
no, of course.
is we're looking at issues of coloniality and carbonisation, and there is a timeline in which you can say that these issues are rooted in practices that were begun even perhaps in or before the 1400s with the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, settler colonialism, and a form of building and fueling the world that is associated with particular kinds of social, class, gendered, sexuality-based, ableist-based discriminations, right, that are really quite deeply embedded within our practices and our ideas of what the world is and how it's made. And so the task of contesting over 500 years of dominant worldview is an enormous one. And that means taking two things quite seriously, which is really rigorously undoing a lot of and unbuilding a lot of the practices that we've inherited, that we've been dealt, the cards we've been dealt. Also, really seriously taking the imaginative project seriously.
Totally.
Right? How do we, if we've inherited over 500 years of thinking, there is an imaginative project on the scale of which is absolutely enormous that requires these kinds of speculative propositions that very radically reimagine what our society looks like when you take sexuality seriously and a broader kind of spectrum of sexuality really seriously and how that remakes the world. And also think about its intersections, as this project does, with class, with production, with labour, with race. And so, it's very exciting to see this kind of work happening.
Yeah.
And it is entirely appropriate for the scale of challenges that we have ahead of us.
Yeah. And I guess it's a bit like a rubber band as well, right? If you speculate on something and have this big, wild speculation, when you pull the rubber band back, even if there's one tiny bit of that is materially doable in the current moment, it's doing something wonderful.
Totally. But I think the thing that really inspires me about our students and our colleagues here at the RCA is that there isn't a sense that we have to wait for that rubber band to snap back.
Right.
We can and should be demanding its fullest extent.
Yeah.
And actually really seriously looking at how do we build that? How do we get there? And that's what the MArch is doing. So it has one unit, the Just Transition unit, which asks students to speculate, to stretch that rubber band to its fullest extent, and then to think about what kinds of work we need to do now in order to realise that vision.
Yeah.
And that's something that I see across all of the programs within our school, which is really exciting, that refusal to accept even the smallest compromise.
Right. Yeah.
And, this is an existential conversation, really. I don't think we have the luxury anymore of accepting piecemeal change.
Yeah. It's so important and it's so difficult, isn't it, to kind of, well, maybe it's just my brain that finds it difficult and scary to imagine from the beginning of the tweaking of the rubber band, how much change can happen.
I think you're right. I think it is scary. And that's why I often use the term brave, because I think you have to be you have to take a leap, actually, and stand by it and put in the work of standing by it.
Yeah. I mean, this is coming from a kind of music point of view, but I know that, David Bowie and Bjork always talk about the idea that, or did always talk about the idea that there should always be a little bit of fear in what you're doing. Not like an overwhelming, like deep anxiety, but just a little bit of fear in what you're doing that keeps you going, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, look, I'd hope that at the RCA, we are giving people a scaffold with which to feel safe to take those risks.
Yeah.
We're also showing them that there is a community around them that can support them and that believes similarly in the necessity and the need for that kind of braveness and imagination. And I think that's what I love about the Biennale, is that it shows on a global scale. Everyone can look at it and say, this is at Venice. Come on, like this is what we need to be doing.
Yeah, for sure. And are there any student works or other alumni projects of note that you could tell us about that are doing some of this good work?
Yes, absolutely. So, okay, there are just honestly too many to mention. I wish I could call on them all. They're fantastic. And thank you for pointing to the online platform RCA 2023. Mm-hmm. A kind of happy consequence of the pandemic was that these online platforms started to be made. So there is also an archive of them, and I would encourage everyone to dive into them.
I think as well, sorry to interrupt, but I think as well there's such, particularly for someone who's not from an architectural background, I find them so useful to look at. It's obviously wonderful seeing the exhibitions, but being able to have like the whole process of someone's thought kind of running through their profile is just so like illuminating.
It's fantastic. It's a brilliant platform. Look, I'm going to name just two.
Okay.
The one I've already mentioned, Lauren Lois-Dewar, who looks at this practice of secondhand clothes and the global economies around it, which are fantastic. That's also hosted on the Venice Biennale website. I also want to draw attention to Folasade Okonribido's work titled The Blue Hour. Mm-hmm. This is just an exceptionally beautiful project which started to be developed during Folasade's MA architecture work, her final year work. She was part of the first cohort that graduated during the pandemic, so we did our kind of last crits and awards ceremony. And I hope Folasade won't mind me saying that when she was awarded the Dean's Prize for the kind of exemplary project of the year, and there was honestly not a dry eye on the Zoom screen.
Oh, wow.
So the work explores the structural properties of colour, producing proposals for an emerging community of young creatives in Nigeria to kind of remake community spaces, but also open up new horizons for themselves and for their futures too, which transcend the imposed restrictions of class, gender, and sexuality, and more. It's an exceptionally beautiful piece of architecture, but underlying it is also this quite radically reconstructed ideology that underpins how architecture should be built, by whom, and to what end. And so I think it's a great project for exemplifying a lot of what we've just been talking about in terms of how a built project responds to this kind of call for ideological change. So they're not at the Biennale, but I also want to draw attention to two new groups. One is DIS, a disability-led research collective, which has been set up by Jordan Whitewood-Neal and James Zatka-Hass, who also worked in the School of Architecture, and DAN, which is the Deaf Architects Network, which was set up by an alumni, Chris Lang. And they're both doing really amazing work to rethink disability, so not as a stage of compliance or the kind of apologetic aftermath of a project. You know, you go around and check that everything works, or that, you know, a wheelchair can move through a space. But rather looking at how centering the lens of disability expands our worlds of design in really inspiring ways. And I think what's quite interesting about both of them as well is that they're doing this practice through bringing people together, through collectivizing, through unionizing, and through hosting events and publications and workshops that kind of start to create spaces for architects and spatial practitioners to look to be strengthened by, to be galvanized by, but also these centers to kind of entirely rethink the discipline too.
Yeah, amazing. The Deaf Architects Network, did you say? Wow.
Right, yeah.
I'm from, both my parents are deaf.
Okay.
But I've never really thought about architecture in terms of the sound of, is that how they're kind of approaching it? Is it to do specifically with sound of space, or just to do with supporting deaf what's their kind of angle on it?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. And Chris Lang's graduation project was also fascinating. So he was designing a kind of headquarters for, I don't know if he called it the Deaf Architects Network at the time, but
Okay.
it was an institution like this, and it was on the South Bank. And so there were lots of strategies and methods that he used in the design that would support a deaf community to be able to navigate the space, that the space would perform for them and enable them to communicate, to host events, to be supported in the best way possible. So often that was through drawing on other senses, through sight, but also through thinking about how this project might become emblematic, so it was sited on the South Bank. It might become a space from which to be seen and to activate a community from, and a new way of thinking from. Chris Lang is also, so Chris worked with interpreters throughout his study. He's since developed with another collaborator a kind of lexicon of BSL that supports discussions around architectural design through BSL, because I think one thing that he found was a limitation with the terms, that he was understanding conversations between his tutors and his interpreter and then himself.
Right.
And so there was a kind of limitation around the lexicon, right? And so he's developed this new series of terms through which education can happen, but also discussions within the studio can happen, discussions between clients. And it's really groundbreaking work, I think. In one of her curatorial statements, Leslie Locke talks about how the discourse around architecture has been dominated by a particular worldview. It's as if it's been spoken with one tongue. And so part of the work of decolonisation and decarbonisation is also to think about new languages with which we speak about architecture, with which we communicate architecture. And necessarily that leads to new forms of architecture too, right? As Chris Lang's project shows.
Yeah.
Spatial formations, material use, an understanding of how a building presents itself will be completely different once you start to expand those languages and terms with which architecture is spoken into being.
Yeah. And I guess who was invited to do the translation isn't every little element of it, right? Like considering that whole thing. And just touching on going back a little bit, you were talking about made by whom, and most of the things you talked about have kind of been on a local level, right? Or at least have had a particular locality. How important is that to architecture in particular, to think more on a local scale rather than trying to do something global?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess part of the work of architecture is to engage with sight and to engage with materiality. So where something is and what it's being made of, and then by extension, who is there, who is doing the making, and what are the dynamics of relation that exist there. And so how does your work engage that? But I'm just trying to think, a project or the work of someone like a BA Camp, whose site is essentially data.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about something quite intangible there. Or indeed in my own work, where I'm thinking about systems of control or surveillance that are made through space-based technologies. I suppose part of the reason why these projects maybe sometimes touch down on sites is so that you can understand both the global scale or the planetary scale of the problem in relation to the frictions that it produces in life, right?
Yeah.
And that these frictions are highly contextual, that they depend on the dynamics that are existing in place. So, and part of that is also because the expressions of coloniality, of racial capitalism, of carbon are different, right?
Yeah.
Depending on where you are. So there is a need to do the broader scale work alongside the specificity of work, and also that they're reliant on one another, that we start to understand one more through its expression on a local scale too.
I think they're both important because I'm probably going to paraphrase Dave Webster slightly wrong, but on the last podcast, I kind of asked him about local and global with design. And what I found interesting in what he said was that you have to focus on the local, but realize that you can't just scale up the local and assume that it will fit every type of global situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's, one thing that is present, I would say, throughout all of our programs, is emblematic of or reflective of this thinking, is that we really encourage students to bring their own passions, to bring their own worlds, to bring their own knowledge systems from where they're coming from, whether that be a part of the world or a position of sexuality or ableist experience of space, to their research and to their practice, because students are not blank canvases. Students come into the RCA with an enormous wealth of knowledge and experience, and that is only to enrich their studies and their experiences here. And we, in turn, are also enormously enriched by that too.
Yeah, of course. Great. Going to have to start wrapping things up now, but before we go, do you have any advice for anyone that wants to engage with these sorts of topics? Obviously they should all go to the Venice Biennale, of course, but aside from that?
Look, this is another one of those enormous questions that, yes, get to the Venice Biennale if you can. It's expensive to go to Venice.
Yeah.
Tragically, it's just simply not possible for a lot of people to get to Venice.
Yeah.
Leslie drew our attention in the first few days of the Venice Biennale about how the Italian government had not given visas to 5 members of her research team based in Accra. She was accused of bringing unnecessary young men to Italy. So,
wow.
Which shows how live and how current the questions of coloniality, of border making, are present within our world, something that will be no surprise to, I'm sure, many people listening to this podcast. And so they've done an incredible job of listing all of the participants on their websites. And so go and look them up, go on their Instagrams, find out about them, travel it digitally if you cannot go physically. But in terms of what would I say, what should you look to? Or there's one book that's kind of disquieted my mind a lot since it came out towards the end of last year, which is a book by the Salvage Collective. It's very skinny, it's almost a pamphlet, and it's titled The Tragedy of the Worker. And I think it kind of skewers our current condition incredibly incisively. It shows how carbon capitalism and coloniality are embedded within social and economic structures. And importantly, how our collective imaginations must be larger than the worldviews that we inherit, The book unflinchingly shows the scale of this work and the tragedy of the limits of our collective unionized work against the forces that seek to destroy and contain us. But it's necessary and inspiring reading for those of us who need to be brave enough, who need to be imaginative enough and militant enough to build these entirely new worlds. And that is all of us, really, or there won't be an us to speak of at all.
Amazing. Wow. Thank you, Thandi. You've been listening to Artcast, the Royal College of Art podcast, home to the next generation of artists, innovators and entrepreneurs, and the world's #1 art and design university. You can learn more about our programmes at rca.ac.uk, as well as finding news and events related to the college and our application portal if you're a prospective student.